The Choose Love movement offers no-cost solutions that keep our kids safe, providing them with the skills and tools they need to flourish. Join us in our mission to create the world we want to live in, one that's connected and compassionate. Check us out at chooselovemovement.org. Together, we can choose love.
Hi, my name is Scarlett Lewis. I'm the founder of the Jessie Lewis Choose Love movement, and welcome to the Choose Love podcast. Today, I have an incredibly fascinating guest, and I've waited a long time to have Kate O'Shea on with us today, and we're going to learn so much. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much, Kate, for being with me today. Kate is a mitigation specialist, and I met Kate when I met with Nicholas Cruz's defense team. And Nicholas Cruz is the Parkland shooter, probably one of the most hated people in the United States during certainly when he committed the Parkland shooting, certainly during the time when the trial was going on and everything was in the news. And Kate, I never even knew that there was a mitigation specialist position, you've taught me so much, and I wanted to, I remember you just opened up so many different lines of thinking for me about why there's so much violence and suffering in our world that we're seeing and how it's played out. And I never realized that there was somebody behind the scenes that was actually pulling apart social biologies, studying generational effects of what's happened to people. I'm going to read what a mitigation specialist is: a complex, multi-pronged approach to preparing for sentencing for a defendant's crime with the goal of reducing or lessening the effects of aggravating factors. Mitigation is the storytelling part of representing the criminal defendant. And, for personally, I think that people were amazed, some disappointed, that I felt compassion for Adam Lanza, who was the murderer in the Sandy Hook school shooting almost 10 years ago now. And but I knew that somebody that could do something so heinous must have been suffering so tremendously that was the only way that he knew, the only way to act, the only way that he could express his suffering. And so that's what you do for a living, which is really incredible. Thank you for being with us.
Of course. Well, thank you for having me, Scarlett. I always tell my clients' families when they say that they don't understand what it is that I'm doing, that, in the course of a person's life, if they're lucky, they will never encounter a mitigation specialist, because if I'm showing up at your door, it means that someone you love has done a terrible thing and the government is seeking to execute them. And it's a trauma, not just for the person who's sitting in jail, and of course for the loved ones, the people that are murdered, but for everyone in my clients' lives. I mean, teachers, neighbors, friends, relatives. It's a terrible thing to think that someone committed a murder and could possibly be killed for it. And so my job is not ever to excuse someone's behavior. Murder, there's no excuse for murder. It's inexcusable. My job is to explain who a person is and answer the question, how could this have happened? Because there's always an answer. I've never, in almost 14 years of doing this, found a case where someone just killed someone for no reason and there was no mitigation and there was nothing in the background. Certainly we all have our traumas, but when things are extreme, people eventually react in extreme ways, and then I end up in their life.
That's what stuck out to me following Jesse's murder was, all of the focus that and I had never really thought about it before, but of course my son's murder made me focus on it. And I thought, wow, what we're doing isn't working. And what are we doing? So I started looking at the anti-bullying, right? And talking to bullying experts and people who, and they're experts because they had been bullied. And, they would say the anti-bullying days in schools were the worst for them because they actually taught the bullies what to do. And then they would turn around and I mean, there are maybe some good anti-bullying programs, but anything that has bullying in the title is right. We focus on the problem. It's like with mental illness, we wait until something happens and then we focus on the illness. We treat the symptoms. We don't look at the root cause. Substance abuse, we do the same for that. And so violence, my son's murder, I thought, there was so much blame on Adam Lanza. It was like a perfect way to take out our anger and shock and horror at what had happened and just blame Adam Lanza and his mom who gave him the gun. And I understood that, obviously, at the time. He is responsible. His mom had culpability in that. But if it was all their fault, it would never have happened before, but it had many times. It would never happen again. It has over 350 times. So it's like, we got to go beyond this blaming, finger pointing, fault finding type thing and start addressing the root cause, which is why when I met you, I was so fascinated that there is someone that goes behind the scenes and tries to figure out what the root cause was. And then I remember asking you, well, where is all of this information? like what happens? Like you dig into these mass murderers' backgrounds, and then how do we learn from all of your efforts? And you're like, oh, it's in their file. And I was like, oh my gosh, because we need to bring this out into the forefront. So I that there was somebody that thought the way that I did, that I love where you say you are who you are because of what happened to you, that people aren't born mass murderers. Right. They are cultivated into what they become by their experiences and their traumas, their early traumas. And that is why they do what they do. And like you say, well, it's no excuse. There's no excuse for murdering another human being. But unless we have the courage to put aside our judgment and our tremendous anger that even goes into hatred, and look at the root causes, unless we address the root causes of what we're seeing more and more of in our society, we're never going to get ahead of this. We're always going to be chasing it down one step behind, which is what we are now. And I believe that what you're doing is you know the root cause. You've already researched this. And so I believe that you have also the solution.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there isn't one easy solution, but I do think that by and large, the problem is trauma. When I took Nick's case, I hesitated. I didn't want to be involved, but I knew it was the right thing to do because being able to investigate Nick's life was a unique opportunity that we don't get very often with mass murderers. Usually they die, either they commit suicide or they're killed by police. And so I knew that representing Nick was an opportunity for me to contribute to the larger conversation in a meaningful way, that I'd never had an opportunity to do that before. And so ultimately that was why I took the case. And although there were certainly days that I wished I hadn't, looking back at it now, I do believe that it was the right thing. And I learned an incredible amount. And unfortunately, there were certain things that we were not allowed to share with the jury, which was disappointing. Admittedly, there had always been sort of a secondary gain, I think, for us when we were investigating Nick's case, because we thought we'd be able to really tell the story and shine the light where it needed to shine. And ultimately, we were not able to talk about a lot of the failures. But there were a lot of people in Nick's life that did recognize that he needed help, and they tried to get him help. But there's just not the right kind of help available for these kids.
And when you talk about failures, you're talking about the failures of the systems and processes that you were unable to talk about at trial.
Correct. Yeah.
That were a part of how Nicholas Cruz became the mass murderer that he became.
Right. Any third-party negligence, the ruling was that it didn't lessen his moral culpability, and maybe it didn't. But when someone is in kindergarten and they're not getting language therapy, they're getting speech therapy so they can speak words correctly, but they're not getting language therapy to understand what is being said to them. Why is that any different than any other kind of neglect? I mean, it's important. It was part of the problem with Nick. One of his traumas, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people, one of his traumas is just living in the world and being Nicholas Cruz and not understanding the emotions of people around him, not understanding the wants or needs of people around him. And it's not a choice that he makes. It's just that he doesn't have the ability.
And that's so interesting, because I think about Adam Lanza.
Yeah.
And when he came into Sandy Hook Elementary School, because he had attended that school, he was tested for special needs, and he was found to have, I think it was 7 special needs, and only 2 were addressed because they were academic. And so by law, we have to address academic needs. And I think one of them was that he had sensory issues. He couldn't touch paper. And the other was a speech impediment. But the other 5 were more social and emotional, as you were describing, and they were not addressed. And so he had this incredible social anxiety where he was often seen crying and alone. And I think everyone's doing the best they can with the skills and tools that they have. I will say that. But on the other hand, if we don't start figuring this out, we are now reading about mass murders almost every single day in the US. And we have to have the courage to start addressing why this is happening and not just focusing on the sentencing end. And that's really kind of why I got involved with Nicholas Cruz. I saw that the death penalty was being sought, and I understand that. And I often think about the fact that Adam Lanza killed himself when he heard the sirens approaching the school after he had murdered 20 first graders in 2 first grade classrooms and 6 educators. He heard the sirens coming and he murdered himself. And I'm grateful for that, because I didn't have to deal with a trial, and I know how incredibly painful that is. But I too became interested because here we have a school shooter that is alive, because oftentimes they're suicidal, then they become homicidal. They know they're going to die, they want to die. And I don't know if that's the case with Nicholas Cruz, but he was alive. And I thought, wow, here actually is an opportunity to figure out what happened so that we might address the root cause for other school shooters and start to get a handle on this.
Yeah, and I'll confess that when I hear about a mass shooting now and the person dies, I feel a little bit of relief, because I think that there won't have to be another one of these trials that will put the victims' families and the world through the trauma that Nick's trial put people through. And I think that if executing Nick served a purpose other than vengeance, maybe it would be different. People ask me all the time why how can you do this work? How can you represent these people? And for me, I mean, obviously I choose love, but the death penalty is an archaic system of government that executes wrongdoers while willfully ignoring its own role in the factors that lead to violent crime. And I personally can't abide that, and I don't. And that's why I do this work. And it's just so important for us to look past the crimes.
I will say that I was pro death penalty before I met you guys. And I thought that it was, well, for one, less expensive. Right? But I didn't realize, and I don't think most people realize, that it is more expensive to execute someone than it is to keep them in jail for the rest of their lives. And I think that I didn't realize that before.
Yeah, it's amazing. The estimate, I think, is it cost about 7 times as much to execute someone. In Florida, the statistic is around, I want to say 21 years from crime to execution, but it's often much more than that. In fact, someone died on death row of natural causes a few weeks ago in Florida. He'd been there since 1977. And there are still a few other people on Florida's death row that have been there since the 70s. And I think if people really understood the death penalty and what goes on, we wouldn't have a death penalty anymore. And I think that's starting to happen. The death penalty is losing its grip. More and more states are abolishing. You see it in the polls. It used to be that 66% of people supported the death penalty. Now those numbers are getting lower every year. And it's funny to me that people who say that they're, right-wing and conservative and financially conservative support the death penalty. And it just tells me that people must not know that the death penalty is actually much more expensive than life in prison.
And I guess one of the arguments, and I'm going to be doing a podcast with Casey Secor, who was also on your team for Nicholas Cruz, talking about the death penalty. But I guess one of the arguments would be, well, if these people know that there's going to be the possibility of a death penalty, then they won't do what they won't commit the mass murder, except that most of these people that do this expect to die. And they not only expect to die, they want to die. That's how much pain they're in, and they want to take out as many people as possible with them. So can you talk about what, and by the way, I agree. I feel like, if in this case, if his death brought the families any more than 5 minutes of relief, I would be for the death penalty in this case too. If it truly would bring relief, and it would bring a solution to the school shooting issue, but it doesn't. And so anyway, I'm wondering what did you learn? Like what did we learn through this scenario, through your work with Nicholas Cruz, and then ultimately, I'd like us to get around to how can we use what you learned to be part of the solution going forward?
Well, one comment I want to make is that there is not one shred of statistical evidence that I've ever seen that supports that the death penalty is a deterrent for murder. I think people either are afraid of getting caught or they're not. And your average run-of-the-mill murderer is not sitting around thinking, well, for life in prison, I would do this, but since I might get the death penalty, I won't do it. I don't believe that that's ever happened, or that it ever will.
You've never seen it happen in your work?
Well, yes. Well, if no one commits a murder, that I don't see them in my work. But no, I can't imagine that people really have that thought process where they decide not to commit a murder because of the death penalty. And in Nick's case, and in the case of mass murderers, I think they want to die. And many of them also want to be famous. And Nick's trial made him a celebrity. I believe that if we had just put him in prison 4.5 years ago, we would not have learned the things that we learned from him, but he would not have been famous. He'd have been long forgotten, and perhaps that would have been more of a deterrent. to a mass murder. I would think that if someone were contemplating mass murder, being famous like Nick might be something that would entice them. Whereas if they were to see that Nick was just growing old alone in prison, maybe they would not be so drawn to mass murder.
Absolutely, 100%. You're right. And that's a really good point. There was a movement, I don't remember when it started, but it was before Sandy Hook, that you do not say the shooter's name. Right. Because they are so starving for attention that they know that their name is going to be reported in the news and that people are going to be talking about them, and they will die for that. And they will murder for that. And really that is all about attention. We all want to love, we want to be safe, but we want to be loved and celebrated as well. And these individuals, kids or adults, they feel like they don't have the healthy connections or the acknowledgement of their existence. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what it comes down to. If someone is so desperate for love and attention that they're willing to kill for it, certainly they're not getting it in the normal places, in the normal ways.
Right. So what else did you learn by going through Nick's life? I mean, you, as a mitigation specialist, you have access to all the records. You have access to every family member, and you not only go from birth to where Nick is now, but you go and you look into his other family members and what their lives were like and what dysfunction they had. And then you go into previous generations.
Right. So with Nick, it was the same as really any other investigation that I've done of whether someone's killed one person or 4 people or 20 people. They all have trauma in common. They almost all have early attachment problems. And early attachment is just so incredibly important, and not having it is very difficult to overcome. In Nick's case, of course, he was adopted by a woman who wanted him and loved him and welcomed him. But when he was in the womb, he was not loved. He was not wanted by the one person that had to protect him. Brenda was an addict. She drank every day. She smoked crack regularly throughout her pregnancy. And so the environment that he literally developed in was not a welcoming or warm one. It was literally toxic for him. And so when he came out of the womb, he was delivered to a woman who loved him and held him, but he wasn't given the amount of right support that he needed. Nick was never going to be okay because of what happened to him in the womb. And his mother didn't know that, because I don't know if it was because she didn't understand the extent to which the adopted mother was abusing drugs and alcohol throughout her pregnancy, or if it was that she knew and just didn't want to face it. But I think there's always, when we're treating kids in the school system, there's always this desire to get them back into normal mainstream classes, right? We give them services until they don't need services anymore. And the goal, it seems like, is always to make them better so they don't need you anymore. But kids like Nick need structure and attention and small one-on-one situations forever. Nick, unfortunately, like a lot of kids who have these kind of neurodevelopmental disorders, was just not ever going to grow out of the needs that he had when he was in kindergarten and preschool. He needed that kind of love and structure all the way until adulthood.
I mean, so he was born also with something that I don't think that we have a lot of awareness of, and that's fetal alcohol syndrome. And I'd never heard of it before, actually, before speaking with you all. And And I know that I've seen brain images of people that were born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and it's like a normal. I was trying to describe it to somebody. If you had a brain as an image of a ball of yarn, right? It would be like, this is a normal brain, but a brain with fetal alcohol syndrome can look something like this. And it is there. And that's what you're working with. I don't know to the extent that you can heal that throughout life, but that's how he started life from day one.
Right. So it used to be called fetal alcohol syndrome, and it used to be that we only had fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effects. And to have fetal alcohol syndrome, you had to have certain facial markers because alcohol affects the development of our brains, our central nervous system, and our facial structure. Now it's understood that it is just as common to have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder where a person is affected in many ways in the CNS without the facial features. And it can be actually worse for a child to have these effects without having the facial features, because a child with facial features will be identified early on as having fetal alcohol syndrome, and people will know to recognize that they need very specific treatments, that they're always going to need structure. But for a lot of kids who are born without it, they go their entire lives being diagnosed with all kinds of other things and no one ever understanding what the problem is. And it's a very prevalent problem, and it's one that just is not talked about enough. And what was one of our hopes in the trial was that people would talk about it more. And so I'm glad that we're able to talk about it today. Because when I look back at the cases that I've done, and I've worked on somewhere around 100 capital cases in the last 14 years, and I realize how much I must have missed fetal alcohol spectrum disorder diagnoses in my work. And so it's something that I'm much more aware of now. And when I sat down and looked at some of the cases that I even have, I realized that I need to investigate FASD. And I think it's something that will always be at the top of my list going forward.
So, and how much alcohol would it take when you're pregnant to negatively impact a baby's forming brain?
Not a lot.
Do you know?
And it certainly is very common for women who are social drinkers who drink on the weekends and don't realize that they're pregnant until they're 12 weeks along. That amount of alcohol, if you're drinking twice a week, every week for 12 weeks of the first 12 weeks of the pregnancy, can affect a child. It's important that a woman obviously stop drinking as soon as she knows that she's pregnant. And if a woman was drinking like that for the first 3 months of the pregnancy, they should be aware when the child is born and as the child gets older, if they see things like behavioral problems, language problems, they should tell their doctor that there was alcohol exposure during the pregnancy. And there's a real stigma with that. And it's a problem. There's nothing wrong with a woman who's in her 20s drinking sometimes on the weekends. But to have a child then who starts to have problems and she starts to realize maybe this is my fault for drinking, that's a very hard pill to swallow. And I'm sure it's even harder to go to your doctor and say, my child has these problems and I think it's because I drank when I was pregnant. But it's something that,
and just the awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just the awareness now, just from us talking about it. You have to name it to tame it. And just for us bringing out this awareness. I mean, these are things that I didn't know either. So interesting, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and how much more prevalent that probably is than we even realize. And that was a part of what happened with Nicholas Cruz and the Parkland shooting.
Yeah.
That was a part of it. It's, I remember sitting with you, Kate, and I said, if you had to boil everything down to one thing, what the one most important thing in everything that you've done, what would you say it is? And you said attachment with the birth mother in the first 2 months. And that just blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be the birth mother. I probably misspoke when I said that. I think that it certainly can be an adoptive mother, but the early attachment, when a child is crying, are their needs being met? When a child is crying, will someone comfort him? Or will someone just come in at the appropriate time and give him a bottle and change his diaper and then leave him back in his crib? And then a child has to learn how to self-soothe. And eventually when that happens, I think a child learns that other people are just a way to get your needs met, as opposed to being able to form actual deep emotional attachments. And that's something that is damaging, and it stays with a person throughout their life. And it's very, very hard to overcome if you don't have it in the first 60 or 90 days of life. It's something that we learned about from these Russian orphanage studies. There were a lot of children in Russia who were in these overcrowded, underfunded orphanages, and they were, not being held, not being comforted when they cried, just being fed and changed the amount that a baby has to be fed and changed to survive. And even when they were being adopted by these rich people who were giving them, it's seemingly everything that they needed, or even when they were being adopted by a middle-class family with lots of love in the home, they were still growing up to be sociopaths. And I say sociopath in a way that probably isn't the way that people perceive it. Lots of people have antisocial traits or sociopathic traits and never harm anyone. In fact, to get ahead in business, it's helpful to have some antisocial traits so that you don't mind stepping over people. But the harmful part is that you don't attach to other people. And it's harmful for people around you, and it's harmful, obviously, for yourself. But that's something that is pretty well founded in the research, that early attachment starts in the very, very early days, and it's important throughout childhood.
And I remember that study goes on that I think there was a new doctor that came in, and he noticed that there were so many deaths of these babies.
Right.
And so what he ordered was for the babies to be picked up and rocked. And the death rate went down to almost zero after that. And, we have this, I don't know who started it, if it was Dr. Spock in the 70s, that book that he wrote. And it was like, don't co-sleep with your child, put your child in another room, let him cry. I know people that, they have their kids on a feeding schedule. And if they cry, it's like they can't be hungry because it hasn't been 4 hours. You know what I mean? And this thought that babies cry to be manipulative or, for no reason. No, they're crying to get attention. And so I think it's so important to have people understand that, especially, I had some family members that just had a child actually 2 years ago, and they were asking me, what do you think about spanking? And and everybody gets their information on Google now, right? Even more than their parents. They trust Google, which is kind of crazy. And so I actually directed them to Howard Glasser's work of the nurtured heart approach, which is basically focusing on the good behavior rather than punishing the bad behavior. But it all kind of it's associated here with child rearing. And so you said, though, that Nick, he had an adoptive mom that she was older. She had yearned for a baby of her own. And then she basically she got Nick right after he was born. So were there early attachment issues there? I mean, I know that he was on the spectrum now for fetal alcohol syndrome, but what about the attachment that he had?
No, I think he had a good attachment with his mother. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that she was She was very good about responding to him, that she was always holding him and showing him off and dressing him up. And she really loved being a mom in the beginning. And then, of course, her husband died unexpectedly when Nick was just before his 6th birthday, which is a horrible trauma for a young child who has difficulties anyway to watch their adoptive father die. And Nick had problems before then. In fact, it was Roger, the adoptive father, who was really pushing Linda, the mother, to take him and get him evaluated. And when Roger died, a part of Linda died too. She became depressed. There's research that suggests that having a depressed mother is actually worse than having an abusive or schizophrenic mother, because at least an abusive or schizophrenic or alcoholic mother is paying attention to you. And a depressed mother will tend to stay in her room with the door closed and, cook dinner and then go back and lie down and not ask how your day was.
Wow.
And when you're a child, the whole world revolves around you. We know that, right? That's why when we get divorced, someone gets divorced with young children, the first thing you say is, this isn't your fault. Because when something changes in their world, a child whose brain isn't developed yet assumes that it's because of them. And so I think with Nick and his brother Zach, their mother became depressed so young, and Nick was already having problems, and Zach was soon to follow. And I cannot imagine what it was like for Linda trying to balance her own mental health with the needs of these 2 boys. And I think it would have been too much for anyone on their own.
And Zach had the same mom and kind of was created in the same environment, correct?
Yes and no. Same mom, different dad, but she was in jail from the time she was about 6 weeks pregnant with him. And she stayed in prison, and he was born. She was still incarcerated, and they took her to the hospital across from the prison where he was born. So he had a protective factor that Nick didn't, which was that she may have used some drugs or alcohol during the pregnancy. You can get your hands on alcohol in prison, but she certainly wasn't smoking crack and drinking Colt 45 every day like she was with Nicholas.
Okay, so would you say that when Nicholas Cruz was born, he was born with special needs?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And
so those special needs weren't really considered or known. He was adopted, and they weren't really addressed. It sounds like what you're saying, they were realizing that there were special needs when he was about 6, and his dad was saying, you need to get him tested, and then he died. Yeah. And so we're at this point where he's had special needs now for 6 years, and they have not been addressed up to that point.
Well, they were doing some interventions. He was in a special preschool, and the preschool teacher there, she testified at trial. She knew there was something else very wrong with Nick. She had worked with autistic kids before. She had worked with special needs kids her whole career, and she knew that he needed more than they could even give him in the structured preschool program. She said, this is structure and this isn't enough. He needs more. And they started to do a referral, and then the teacher transferred to another school, and the whole plan was never followed through. And so he ended up starting at a different school than he might have. And in his early years, Nick got a lot of services. There were a lot of people around him. The elementary school that he went to was wonderful. But again, there was this goal of getting him out of the structured program that he was in and putting him back in mainstream. And Nick was just never going to be okay there. He would have periods of success. And you see that with children who have all kinds of disabilities, that they have these periods of success because there are extra supports in place and because they want to do well. Children want to do well. And it was no different for Nick. Unfortunately, the timing was that he did well in 5th grade. And so he was sent to a normal mainstream middle school with much less support than he needed. And things really just sort of went off the rails when he was in middle school.
So what the teacher, his preschool teacher, was trying to give him more support. And if she had been successful, what would that have looked like?
Well, he might have been able to go to a center for children whose behaviors are a manifestation of their disability and stayed there throughout his school years. He ended up there when he was in 8th and 9th grade, and he did very, very well, better than he'd ever done. And because he did well, they moved him back to regular school. And I don't know that the law allows for a child to be put in a center and kept there because it's what he needs. The law is that the student should be put in the least restrictive environment for them to succeed. So still, I think that law can be sort of misinterpreted, because for some kids, a small special center is the least restrictive environment in which they can succeed. But it's generally sort of considered that the goal is to mainstream a child. And sometimes that's just not the right answer.
So I didn't even realize these centers existed. What are they?
Well, so there's one called Cross Creek School, which is where Nick was for a couple of years in Broward County. It's a wonderful school with a very small teacher to student ratio. They have counselors available every day, all day. They have an on-site psychiatrist, and children's needs are met both academically, they work at their own level, and socially and emotionally, because there's a lot of positive reinforcement, there's close monitoring, there's not a lot of sensory overload from being in a large school. And there are teachers who have the right kind of experience and training to deal with kids who have very specific needs.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because obviously the goal would be to mainstream somebody if they are capable of that, and to figure out the people that aren't. And most probably would be able to be mainstreamed at some point if their needs were met and they were given enough social and emotional skills, tools, and attitudes to work with. I know people that had horrific beginnings that, are successful, productive adults with incredible families of their own now. So it's hard to determine who is going to succeed and who isn't. It's complicated there.
Sure. And there are kids who have adversity in their backgrounds, that have neurodevelopmental problems, that are successful, that do succeed. It was something that I saw a lot when I worked in Miami. There would be a family of 5 or 6 or 7 kids, with some of them would have different dads, and some of them would be in and out of jail. And then there would be one who was able to get out of the neighborhood. Maybe they joined the military, maybe they were good at sports. And so it would be difficult when we were presenting our case. It was easy to say, well, the youngest brother grew up in the same terrible household and he's fine. But there's always some additional support. Maybe it's a little bit higher intelligence. Maybe it's a football coach that cared when they were very young. So certainly some kids with the right tools and the right supports can succeed when they have early problems like that. But that can't be the expectation. I think that tends to be the exception, but we expect it to be the rule. And we think people should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and overcome and snap out of whatever happened to them when they were children. And that's just not reasonable or possible.
I think my mom made a comment the other day. We were talking about Gabor Mate's most recent book, The Myth of Normal. And in that, he basically, based on his research and his decades as a trauma expert, believes that the vast majority of the dysfunction that we're seeing in our society is based on trauma. And I was talking about little T and big T trauma. And my mom was saying, well, isn't everything big T trauma, really? I mean, what is little T trauma? And I thought that was a really good point, because, you're this child, and the adult in your life, or adults, aren't meeting your needs. And so you either can say, well, you're not really thinking this, but I guess your subconscious is thinking, well, it's too scary for me to think that I'm with adults here that aren't sufficient to meet my needs. So it's got to be my fault.
Right.
And so it's that blame, shame that you carry around with you, and guilt for the rest of your life. And then you start working and making decisions from these unmet needs rather than making choices, healthy choices.
Yeah. For me,
Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. When I start with a new client, my objective is to help them understand that they are the sum of their experiences, and that they are where they are because of things that happen to them. And I don't sit down with a client and say, okay, tell me all the bad things that ever happened in your life. I ask them some background questions, and then in developing a relationship, when they start to understand that the decisions that they made are their own, but were also influenced by other things that happened to them, that's when they want to tell me, because they want to talk through and they want to process their traumas. And that's how I learn from them what happens. And certainly I learn it from collateral sources too, but it's important to me to help my clients get there on their own.
Because there's so many reasons to do that. And it's fascinating for those who want to solve these societal issues to understand why this happened. And instead of finger pointing, fault finding, blaming, they're evil, looking behind the scenes, because no one's born evil. No one is born evil. I think it's just, to make this all pretty simple, I think that's the rule. And then it is what happened to them during their life experiences. You said earlier that we are the sum of our life experiences. And this is why my rabid focus on teaching kids essential life skills from an early age, because everyone has hurt and pain to varying degrees. Everyone lives with disappointment and has loss. And so having these skills and tools to be able to manage this, and then someone like Nick is working with a damaged brain. Right. to start out with. And so that complicates things exponentially. But I think those kids that have the healthy brains, that and this is, Dr. Amen from the Amen clinics across the country. He has the largest database of SPECT scans of brains. And he just thinks everybody should get their brain scanned. And I agree, except that it's expensive. And he has a story about, it's actually his nephew that threatened to shoot up a school, and he brought him in, did a SPECT scan, and found a tumor on his brain, removed it, and now he's graduated from college and mainstreamed, and he's fine. But it always goes back to the brain and the health of the brain. And if you have a healthy brain, you can be taught social and emotional skills and tools, and you can manage the hurt and the pain that comes along. And in fact, you can grow through it. You learn from it, grow through it. You're strengthened by it, post-traumatic growth. And then, as in the case of the youngest in that Miami family, right, of 5, you've got the youngest that's excelling. And then the others, have different stories and different experiences, but maybe also different brain health that leads them in a different direction.
Sure. And, I think it was 2016, the Supreme Court finally recognized that juvenile brains are different than adult brains. The science has, in recent years, we've extended what we consider the developmental period into the mid-20s. We know that 18 is frankly a completely arbitrary number. But until 2005, in the United States, a juvenile could still be sentenced to death. And recently, we've realized that giving juveniles automatic life sentences without the possibility of parole is unconstitutional. And so there are hundreds of people in Florida who were serving life sentences, who were sentenced as juveniles, and now they're all being resentenced. I've done a few of them, and one of the protective factors against reoffending is average or better intelligence. And that certainly isn't something that is a choice to have or not have average or better intelligence. Not having a major mental disorder or neuropsychological problems are also protective factors against reoffending. And so that to me is just evidence that everything does go back to our brains. And living through trauma when we're children changes the way that our brain develops. It stunts development. And so I have these clients who were 17 and a half years old and just not thinking and doing things that are completely irresponsible and having no concept of how their actions affect other people. And it's not that they were cold-blooded killers, it's that they were still children, right? A child doesn't understand when he knocks his milk over that the mother is now going to have to stop what she's doing and clean it up, right? And it's not that he doesn't care about his mother, it's that he doesn't have the capacity yet to appreciate the impact of his actions on other people. And I think that is so much worse, and it lasts so much longer when a child has lived through trauma. We know, for example, there have been studies that the hippocampus in children who were trauma exposed is up to 15% smaller than children who are not exposed to significant trauma. And it's so well documented and understood now that trauma changes our brain chemistry. And what we have to do now is figure out, how do we put it back? And that's a very difficult thing to do. Trauma is hard to overcome. But what I see with my clients, and certainly I saw it with Nick, was that they have these traumas and they end up in therapy. And you think, oh, finally, they're getting what they need. But what they're being taught is coping mechanisms and heavy, deep breathing. And those things are good, but they don't address the root cause. They're Band-Aids. And in a controlled environment, someone can remember, okay, I need to stop and count to 10 right now. But until we deal with and help them process the underlying pain, those coping mechanisms are not going to work forever.
It's the difference between coping and processing.
Right.
And, coping is living with, but processing is actually taking that painful experience. It's changing the perspective on it, and it's utilizing skills and tools to be able to integrate that into wisdom, and then moving beyond it, using it as a step stool to move beyond. That's possible, but we have to teach those essential life skills. It's so interesting. And I think, going back to the age of majority, I think because we can join the military at 18. And so that's why that was considered an adult, because we can ship you off to war. But then we realized, I think, that's way too young for a legal drinking age, because these are still kids. So we moved the drinking age to 21, but actually the brain doesn't fully develop until around 25. And I think that has to be remembered. I mean, it's interesting. You can't rent a car until you're 25, right? Because the insurance companies understand that you don't make very good judgments until you're 25. So they're not going to rent a car to you until you're 25. And so some people have realized this when it comes to monetary damages. You know what I mean? So fascinating. And then you actually had brought up earlier when we were speaking before we started recording this, conduct disorder and antisocial disorder, which I haven't even really touched on in my talks or my research. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Conduct disorder is something that I see, and I would say at least 99%, if not 100% of my clients. Conduct disorder is a disorder that it's a diagnosis that can only be given to someone under the age of 18. And it's a pervasive pattern of behaviors that are destructive or aggressive. It's a serious violations of rules. And I was reading up on it before we started talking today. And the specifiers are either childhood onset type, which is age 10 or earlier, or adolescent onset type, which is no evidence of it before age 10, but starting at or after age 11. And it makes you think, if an 8-year-old is doing things like destroying property, using weapons, setting fires, certainly we immediately think, whoa, what is going on with this child? What is going on at home? But somehow when they get to be 13 or 14 and they start exhibiting these behaviors, we think there's something wrong with the child. And the risk factors, and I'll read right from the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The environmental risk factors include parental rejection and neglect, inconsistent child rearing practices, harsh discipline, physical or sexual abuse, lack of supervision, early institutional living, frequent changes of caregivers, parental criminality, and certain kinds of familial psychopathology. I mean, these are traumas. This is a trauma-based disorder. Mm-hmm. And I hear psychologists say, well, the DSM-5 and those diagnoses, we need a diagnostic code so we can bill the insurance for treating a person. And that's fine. But conduct disorder and later antisocial personality disorder are labels that stick with a child forever. And I think it suggests, just by the name conduct disorder, that the conduct is what you have to be treating. And when in fact, you should be treating all of those things that I just said. Because if an 8-year-old is setting a fire, well, something is going on at home. And we need to look past what the child is doing and find out why and what's going on at home. Well, Scarlett, I certainly feel very privileged and blessed to know you. And it's an absolute honor to be on your podcast and be part of your movement. And I've learned so much from you, and I continue to learn so much from you. And I look forward to everything else that we'll do together in the future.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much, Kate.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Hey, hey, oh. It's all part of us. We can all choose love. It'll lift you up.